In a mist-shrouded village nestled between quiet hills, two twin boys once promised they would never part, no matter where life tried to pull them. But destiny doesn't need permission. It only needs one good reason to rip people apart. When one boy packed his books for the city, his twin stood barefoot in a muddy field, clutching a hoe twice his size. No one asked the boy if he wanted to quit school. Their father had simply said, "This house can only afford one dream." So one left, one stayed. One lived among libraries and lecture halls. The other learned to plant vegetables and feed pigs, just to keep his brother's dream alive. One learned to write essays about the future. The other learned to break his back so that future wouldn't die too soon. 10 years passed, and the one who left returned. But no one in the village called it a reunion, because what he brought back wasn't just a gift. It was an apology that had never been spoken. A silent offering to the brother whose hands no longer felt the rain, because the calluses had grown too thick. The rain had just stopped when their father called them in. Elijah and Elias, identical in face, but not yet in fate, stood side by side in the dim kitchen, their heads still damp from playing barefoot in the puddles outside. The kitchen smelled of boiled cassava and kerosene. Their father, Mr. Abraham Cole, sat silently at the wooden table, his work-worn hands folded, his eyes dark with a kind of worry they didn't yet understand. He looked at his sons, his only sons, then dropped the words like stones. "Only one of you can go back to school." The silence was so sudden, so thick. It was like the air had forgotten how to move. Elijah blinked. Elias didn't. "Why?" Elias asked softly. Their father sighed, rubbing his temples. "Your mother's medicine costs more now. The harvest wasn't good. I took on debt last season. And this year we can't pay for 2 school fees. One must stay and help on the farm." Elias's eyes darted to Elijah's. They always knew this day might come. Rumors had circled in whispers and unfinished sentences for weeks. Over dinner, in the market, during church, but no one had dared say it out loud. Until now. Mr. Cole didn't wait for a reply. He stood up, as if the conversation was finished. "Elijah," he said quietly, "pack your things. The bus leaves at dawn." That was it. Elias opened his mouth to protest, but stopped. Not because he agreed, but because Elijah turned to him with a look that said, "I won't go unless you let me." And in that moment, with their father's footsteps fading down the hallway and the rainwater still dripping from their cuffs, Elias made a choice that would alter both their lives. He forced a smile and said, "Go." Elijah didn't nod. He didn't thank him. He didn't need to. Between twins, some things don't require words. That night, while Elijah folded his shirts into a small suitcase, Elias fed the animals in silence, and as the lantern flickered low in the window, he whispered to the goats, "He's going to make it. I'll make sure of it." Morning came with the scent of damp earth and fried plantains. Elijah stood near the old bus stop with his mother's scarf tied loosely around his neck, his small suitcase by his feet, and his brother's silent blessing weighing more than any luggage could. Elias didn't come to see him off, not because he didn't care, but because he couldn't bear to watch the moment the road would take his twin away. Back at home, Elias had already begun his new life. At 14, his back bent over rows of beans while his brother rode toward blackboards and textbooks. It was as if time had split for the two boys. One timeline for dreams, another for duty. The village noticed. At first, the neighbors praised Elias. "Such a good boy, staying back to help. He's the real backbone of the family," they'd say. But over time, the praise faded. When a teenager should have been sitting in a classroom, Elias was seen hauling sacks of feed, building chicken coops, and bartering with traders twice his age. They began to whisper instead. "What a shame. He was the smarter one. Sacrificed too much. He'll regret it someday." But Elias didn't flinch. Every time he stumbled over a tree root or burned his palms flipping hot metal pans for lunch, he reminded himself, Elijah is studying. That's what matters. And in the city, Elijah carried that weight like a second spine. He walked into the boarding school surrounded by strange faces, all wearing pressed uniforms and shiny shoes. His were secondhand. He didn't mind. When he wrote his essays, he pressed harder into the paper than anyone else. When he read, he devoured words like a starving man. Every scholarship won, every test aced. It was Elias's sweat repaid. But success came at a price. Each letter Elijah sent home grew shorter, and each time Elijah read it, he could feel the distance stretching wider, longer, quieter. It was nobody's fault, just the silent erosion of two boys living in opposite worlds. Years passed. One boy became a man with a university ID. The other, a man with cracked heels and hands that couldn't be cleaned no matter how long he washed. Then, the letters stopped, not out of malice, but out of life. Elias had never been much of a reader, but he read every one of Elijah's letters like scripture. He'd open them slowly, sometimes holding the envelope to his nose first, trying to catch a trace of city air, ink, or his brother's scent, though he knew better. Each letter was carefully folded, usually smudged at the corners from Elijah's excitement or long nights. Sometimes they came with pressed leaves from university grounds, or quotes scrawled in the margins. One even had a photo of Elijah at a campus debate, standing tall in a suit that Elias recognized as the one they'd both outgrown. But Elijah had tailored. Elias never wrote back. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to say it. What could he write that wouldn't sound like a burden? Today I tilled a rocky patch and reopened the wound on my palm. Today I found out one of the hens is sick, but we can't afford medicine. No, Elijah needed to stay focused. The dream had to survive, untouched by the mud Elias now wore like skin. But then, one dry season, the letters stopped coming. At first, Elias told himself the post office was just late, or maybe Elijah had exams. Maybe the university had flooded in one of those city storms that people on the radio talked about. Maybe he waited a week, then 2, a month, then 3. The mailbox at the edge of their property, a rusted metal box on a crooked stick, stood empty day after day. He still checked it every morning before the sun rose, still paused after milking the goats, eyes scanning the dirt road for a shape, a shadow, a figure that never came. By the 6th month, his father stopped asking. By the 7th, their mother did too. Elias never mentioned it. Instead, he poured himself deeper into work. He grew leaner, stronger, and more silent. The chickens multiplied. The fields stretched wider. The barn was patched. The well deepened. The entire farm pulsed with life, even as Elias himself slowly faded into routine. Sometimes, after dinner, he would sit under the old fig tree and whisper aloud, "You better be okay, little brother." One evening, nearly 2 years after the last letter, something changed. A car, dust, silence, then the headlights in the dark. Someone was coming down the road. The vehicle was unfamiliar, sleek, polished, too clean for the village road. It slowed as it neared the house, tires crunching gravel that had long since been buried under dust. Elias stood frozen on the porch, his shirt clinging to his chest, soaked from the day's work. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand, the one with the thickest calluses, and squinted into the light. The car door opened. A foot stepped out, a leather shoe, polished, then another, and then came the face. It hadn't changed much. Sharper now, older, but still unmistakably Elijah. He stood there in a crisp shirt tucked neatly into tailored trousers, holding a small suitcase and a paper bag that smelled faintly of city bread. His hair was combed back, his skin a little paler than Elias remembered, but his eyes, they darted nervously, as if unsure whether to smile or to cry. Elias didn't move, not at first, then slowly. Without a word, he stepped off the porch. His boots hit the ground with weight. He walked toward Elijah. One deliberate step at a time, like someone approaching a ghost. They stopped, face to face, inches apart. I wasn't sure you'd still be here, Elijah said softly. Elias raised an eyebrow. Where else would I be? Silence. Then, Elijah looked down, ashamed. I should have written. I know. Elias didn't nod, didn't scold. He simply said, Are you hungry? It was an invitation, a truce, inside the house. Their mother burst into tears the moment she saw him. Their father didn't speak, but his eyes glistened as he reached for Elijah's shoulder with a grip far gentler than Elias had expected. They all sat at the table, like a family again, but also not. So much time had passed. Too many things had been said in silence. Too many truths buried under harvests and exams. After dinner, Elijah finally reached into his bag. I brought something, he said, placing the gift gently on the table. It was long, wrapped in cloth, and tied with a simple string. Elias looked at it with suspicion. Open it. He untied the knot, peeled back the cloth, and stared. It was a pen, but not just any pen. It was their pen. The one they had once shared as boys, passed between their desks, fought over, wrote dreams with. He had carved a tiny E into its side the night before they got their first report cards. Except now, it was polished, restored, refilled with ink, engraved with new words. For the hands that made my dreams possible. Elias stared at it for a long time. His throat tightened. But no words came. Elijah finally spoke, voice barely above a whisper. I've come back for good. I turned down a job offer. I'm building something here with you. Elias blinked. Here? Elijah nodded. Not just on the farm. I've saved up. We can open something. A training center. For kids who can't afford school fees. For boys like us. The room fell into silence. Elias held the pen tightly. It wasn't just a gift. It was the return of a vow, one made in muddy fields and broken apart by sacrifice. And now, somehow, beginning again. The next morning began without words. Elias rose before sunrise. As always, he still lit the fire, boiled the water, and carried feed to the animals with muscle memory forged from 10 silent years. But something was different. There was an extra plate on the table. There were footsteps behind him, lighter, uncertain, but familiar. Elijah stood beside him, sleeves rolled up, holding a rusty bucket. Show me what to do. Elias glanced sideways. You sure? Elijah nodded. I may not know your world, but I want to. And so, the city boy learned to carry hay without coughing. He learned how to tell when the soil needed rest. He stumbled, fell, laughed, and cursed, but he stayed. By the end of the week, their father said quietly to no one in particular, Funny, now it feels like we have 2 sons again. But Elijah's plans went beyond feeding chickens. In the evenings, while Elias rested under the fig tree with sore arms, Elijah drew sketches on scrap paper, blueprints, classrooms, a community space with wooden benches, solar panels, chalkboards, computers. One night, Elias asked, Why do you want to do this here? You could build it in the city, with real investors. Elijah didn't look up from his drawing, because this is where kids get left behind, just like we almost did. That night, they talked more than they had in years, about the past, about what was lost, and what could still be saved. The training center began as a whisper, then it became a plan, then a foundation. Literally, Elijah invested everything he'd saved. Elias sold 2 cows and half the crop from that season. Their father offered the old barn as the first classroom. Villagers came out of curiosity. Some came out of doubt. Education? Here? Who's going to pay for it? They're just farmers. But slowly, as the walls went up and volunteers arrived from nearby towns, something shifted. One day, a boy from down the road, a quiet one who had dropped out of school at 13, came by holding a notebook and asked, Can I sit in the back? Elias said, You can sit in the front. By the end of the month, they had 15 students. By the end of the year, they had 60. And the pen, old one, engraved with the words Elias would never forget, was now displayed in a glass case at the entrance, a symbol, not of wealth or degrees or glory, but of one brother's sacrifice and another's return. People began calling it the twin school, but to Elias, it was something else entirely. It was a field that had finally grown something he couldn't plant with his hands. The old fig tree still stood beside the house, its roots deeper now, its branches wider, just like the lives it had silently watched unfold. It had been 5 years since that opening ceremony, 5 years since Elias gave the speech that echoed far beyond the village borders. No recording existed, but people still repeated parts of it from memory. It had traveled by word of mouth, passed between mothers at the market, teachers in neighboring towns, and even found its way into a newspaper column once, the silent twin who built a school. The twin school had grown. What began with 60 students now taught over 200, many of whom came from villages farther than Elias or Elijah had ever seen on a map. They now had 2 permanent teachers, 3 volunteer instructors, and 1 small dormitory for students too poor to commute. Elijah still handled the grants and paperwork, shuttling between cities for meetings, but he always came back. Always. Elias, on the other hand, became the heart of the campus. He was the one the children trusted, the one who fixed the broken chairs, planted the school garden, and taught them how to build things with their hands. Coops, fences, hope, and yet, success never hardened them. They still ate dinner under the stars most nights, still passed the old pen between them to jot down ideas in the school logbook, still ended long days with tired laughter and quiet gratitude. But then, one rainy evening, Elijah returned from a city trip looking pale. He clutched a folder in his hand, not blueprints, not financials, medical results. It was cancer, stage 2, treatable, but not without cost, not just in money, but in time, in strength, in spirit. Elias said nothing that first night, just sat by his brother's side while rain hammered the roof. "You don't have to fight this alone," Elias said softly. "I know," Elijah whispered. "That's why I came home." The village rallied like a rising tide. Students wrote letters, mothers brought meals, volunteers took on Elijah's duties. And Elias did something he hadn't done since he was a child. He left the farm. He traveled with Elijah to the city, slept in hospital corridors, held his hand through chemo sessions, read to him on the worst days, brought him roasted groundnuts from street stalls, just to make him smile. And through it all, he never once said, "I gave up my life for you." Because by then, it was no longer true. They had built this life together. The invitation came in a thick cream envelope, sealed with gold foil and embossed with a crest neither Elias nor Elijah recognized. It was from the Ministry of Education. "In recognition of your outstanding contribution to rural youth empowerment and educational reform," the letter read, "you are hereby invited to the National Excellence Gala, where you will receive the Presidential Medal for Civic Honor." Elijah smiled weakly from the hospital bed. He was thinner now, paler, but the color in his eyes had returned. "Looks like they found out about us." Elias held the letter like it might burn him. "I don't want to go." "You have to." "No, you have to," Elias said, folding the letter and slipping it back into the envelope. "You built this school. You deserve the medal." Elijah leaned back, eyes searching his brother's face. "We built it, Eli." But Elias shook his head. "You stood on a stage. I stood in a field. And I'm okay with that." He meant it. So 3 weeks later, Elijah traveled, this time not for treatment, but for recognition. The gala was held in the capital, in a grand hall draped in velvet and gold. Politicians, philanthropists, and educators filled the room. Cameras flashed, speeches echoed off marble walls. When Elijah's name was called, applause thundered. But as he walked to the stage, he paused. "I'm honored," he said into the mic, voice steady, "but I need you to know I don't accept this alone. He turned toward the audience and lifted the medal slightly. The person who deserves this isn't in this room. He's back home, fixing a fence post or teaching a child how to graft a tree. The room quieted. I can write, I can speak, I can plan, but everything I've built was made possible by the man who gave up his own education to fund mine, the one who never left the soil, so I could learn to read. His name is Elias. He's my twin. He's the reason I'm standing here. The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was long, reverent. And later that night, as Elijah rode the overnight bus back to the village, no limo, no hotel, he clutched the medal in both hands like it might vanish. He arrived at dawn. Elias was already up. Boiling water for tea. Elijah didn't say anything. He just set the medal on the table and poured them each a cup. I didn't keep it, he said. Elias smiled. Didn't expect you to, huh, Mom? They drank in silence. As the first rays of light touched the roof of the twin school, no newspaper ran the full story. No plaque was ever made for Elias. But every child who walked through those doors knew the truth. Sometimes, the greatest builders never lay bricks. They just stand in the shadows long enough for others to see the light. It had been more than a decade since the first class sat cross-legged on the concrete floor of the old barn, balancing books on their knees. Since then, hundreds had come and gone, some to trade schools, some to college, some to farms of their own. The walls had been painted over 3 times. A new science lab had been added. The garden now fed over half the school. But one afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in golden amber, a stranger arrived at the gate. He wasn't a child anymore. He was a tall man in his late 20s, wearing scuffed shoes and a brown satchel. But his eyes, wide, alert, determined, hadn't changed since the day he nervously asked to sit in the back of class. His name was Kofi. Elias remembered. You taught me to use a hammer, Kofi said, hugging Elias tight. And you, sir, he turned to Elijah. You taught me how to write a resume. They laughed, embraced, and then sat beneath the fig tree like old friends who never needed to fill the silence. After some time, Kofi pulled out a small wooden box from his satchel. It was simple, carved from smooth mahogany, with a latch made of brass. I brought something, he said. He handed it to Elias. Inside was a seed, just one, large, dark, carefully preserved. Elias looked confused at first. Then Kofi explained, this is a kola nut seed. My grandfather used to say that whoever plants one with his own hands is making a vow to return, to give, to honor. I brought this back from Ghana, where I now teach. I want it to grow here, on this land, where I first learned who I could become. Elias swallowed hard, his hands suddenly unsure. Kofi continued, I'm building a new school there, for the kids who don't make it past 6th grade. I named it after this one. It's called, Twin Roots. Neither Elijah nor Elias could speak. Tears welled. No medal, no ceremony. No letter from a minister had ever struck them this deeply. They stood together as Kofi knelt and dug a small hole near the base of the fig tree. With careful fingers, he placed the seed in the earth, covered it, patted it down. He stood. Now there'll be something that grows from me. Nayana, because something once grew from you. That evening, the 3 of them shared roasted yams and spiced tea. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to, because somewhere between the soil and the stars, something sacred had been passed on, not just knowledge, but the legacy of sacrifice, the kind that multiplies quietly, the kind that plants schools in far-off lands, the kind that begins with twins and never truly ends. The fig tree had grown heavy with fruit. Its branches bowed low now, thick and gnarled with time. Underneath its shade, 2 old men sat on a wooden bench worn smooth by the years. They didn't look much alike anymore. One hunched from decades of physical labor, the other thinner from illness long overcome. But when they laughed, the sound was unmistakably twin. Elijah had started wearing reading glasses. Elias still refused to wear shoes unless it was Sunday. The school behind them was unrecognizable from the barn they had once patched with tarps and prayers. It now had 3 wings, a solar array on the roof, a library named after their mother, and a plaque at the entrance that simply read, "To the ones who planted first." That was Elias's idea. No names, he had said, shaking his head years ago. Let them imagine it could have been anyone, even themselves. Children still ran through the courtyard, laughter skipping like stones across water. The newest batch of volunteers arrived from 3 different countries, and every few months, a letter would come from twin roots in Ghana, photos of kids holding up math books, teachers wearing shirts with the original twin school's emblem. On this particular afternoon, Elijah held a small leather notebook on his lap. He'd been journaling more lately. Memories, ideas, quiet gratitude. He flipped to a page near the middle. "You remember," he asked, "how I used to say I owed you everything?" Elias waved a hand, annoyed. "Don't start with that again." Elijah chuckled. I'm just trying to find the right word for what this all became. It wasn't just a school, not just a second chance. It was a return." Elias nodded slowly, staring at the horizon where the fields met the sky. "Funny thing about farming," he said. "You never know which seeds will take. You just keep planting." Silence fell between them, but it wasn't empty. It was full, with children's voices, distant birds, the whisper of wind through old leaves, and the beating of 2 hearts that had once been born minutes apart and never truly separated. Elijah closed the notebook. "You ever regret it?" he asked. Elias looked at his brother, then at the school, then at the tree. He smiled. "No, because some of us are meant to leave, and some of us are meant to stay behind, so that there's something worth coming back to." And with that, they sat shoulder to shoulder under the tree. 2 men who had started life in the same crib, taken different roads, and built something together that neither could have done alone. And just beyond them, near the edge of the garden, a new sapling swayed in the breeze, tall, proud, grown from a cola nut planted by a student who had once sat in the back of class. The cycle continued, quiet, steady, eternal. Some stories are built with bricks, others with chalkboards, textbooks, and hands too calloused to write. But the most powerful ones, they are built with sacrifice. This is not just the story of 2 brothers. It's the story of what happens when love doesn't ask for recognition, when one stays behind, not to be forgotten, but so that something greater can grow. If this story touched your heart, remember, you don't have to be famous to plant something that lasts forever. You just have to love deeply, give quietly, and stand your ground until someone comes back with a gift that changes everything.